Hello, and welcome back to the world of Wysteria. We will now continue with part 2 of chapter 20. They began walking, touring the grounds, Will and Emily a step behind Jeremy, waiting for him to set the agenda for today. After a few minutes, Jeremy stopped beneath the canopy of one of the trees. "Lovely," he remarked, gazing up into its rosy branches. He stepped over to the trunk and caressed it with slow, firm strokes, as one might pet a large animal. "What noble beings," he said, bridging the earth to the sky. Then, giving it a solid pat, he took a seat on the grass. "The way you moved down from the tower, that was traveling, wasn't it?" said Will, as he and Emily both sat down. "You didn't hop. You disappeared completely, then reappeared." "Yes," Jeremy replied. "Your leap over the ravine, like our flight yesterday, was worldcraft. However, since this world is not mine, I tunneled down." "Tunneled," he said. "Another term for skipping," Emily interjected. "Boys tend to call it tunneling. It sounds manlier, I guess. You know, digging in the ground, getting all dirty." "How about frolicking?" Will suggested. That is pretty cute," she murmured. "So," said Will, addressing Jeremy, "you can't fly here then?" "No," he said, "not as we flew in my world. I cannot alter the substance of this world, or the rules that govern it. Only you can manipulate the environment here. Of course, since I have the ability to alter my body, I can affect the way in which the world interacts with me." "I'm not sure I understand," said Will. "If this were my world," Jeremy explained, "I could command the wind to carry me down from the tower. Or I could change the structure of the air and float to the ground. There are countless possibilities. Outside of my world, I must deal with things as I find them. But no matter where I am, my mind has some measure of control over my body. I could have flown down from the tower, Will, not by altering the environment, but by altering myself, making my body much lighter, nearly as light as the air here. Today, though, I chose another route. I left your world entirely, then re-emerged in a different location." "Is it easier for you to tunnel?" Emily asked him. "Easier," he said. "It seems more direct, I suppose." "Is altering one's body a building skill or a traveling skill?" Will asked. "Neither," he replied, "or both. It is a dreaming skill. Anyone can learn to manipulate his or her dream body." "You've told me that before," said Emily, "but I can't get the hang of it. Since it involves visualization, I think it's easier, more natural for a builder." "Perhaps so," Jeremy conceded. "How is it done?" said Will. "I assume there's a technique." At one time or another, most people experience changes to their bodies in dreams, he replied. They may find themselves able to fly, or their bodies may become heavy and sluggish, making it difficult to run when pursued. And it is they who cause this to happen. Their bodies are responding to subconscious thoughts or feelings, elation or fear and anxiety. It's no different from any other form of creation, though it can be more challenging. For one's body image is deeply rooted and difficult to override. It requires confidence and composure, as well as practice and patience, he added, casting a glance at Emily. But developing the skill is well worth the effort, for various reasons. Will was about to ask how a person goes about learning this skill, when Emily spoke up, broaching a new subject. You told me you began as a builder and then later learned to travel, she said. But when? Were you still mortal? No, Jeremy answered. It was not until I left the waking world behind that I began to experiment with traveling, though, at first, only within my own world. It seemed a convenient and efficient way to get from one place to another. Visiting other worlds did not really occur to me. It certainly didn't interest me. What was the point? I could create any world that I wished for. But I began to grow curious about the dark realm itself, what it was, where it was. Rather than merely pass through it, I did my best to hover there as long as I could. It took some time, but I had plenty of that. And through trial and error, I finally found the clue. I learned how to empty myself, to become profoundly still, only for moments, but time is dense there, almost infinitely so. It was long enough to understand. Then, within that uniform emptiness, I noticed subtle fluctuations, signals, which one day I followed and entered a foreign world. I see, said Emily. But are there mortal dreamers who are ambidextrous? Ambidextrous, he repeated. A fine term, Emily. I shall remember that. Yes, there are such mortals, but they are extremely rare. Crafting and traveling require different states of mind, and having an attachment to the waking world greatly complicates things. So, she said, it seems that Will is rather special. That he succeeded in leaving his world is encouraging, said Jeremy. But he needed your help, and mine. It's still not certain that he'll be able to travel on his own. Before you gave us the push to get started, said Will, you mentioned something about waiting for us with the door open. Yes, Jeremy replied. I cast a wide net, one might say. I allowed the greatest possible opening through which you could enter. Because Emily was familiar with my world, you two still might have found your way in, unless, of course, I sought to deny you entry. You can do that? Will asked him. You can close off your world to visitors? Not entirely, he answered, but I can make it very difficult to enter. I can constrict the entrance, narrow the signal. It would be a challenge for anyone to find the door. Could I do that? Keep out unwanted guests? Could you? Said Jeremy. No, not at this point. Not without raising your lovely realm. That's too bad, Will lamented. That would solve our problems. Perhaps, he said, but there are less drastic solutions. The more control you have over your world, the less you need to worry about intruders. They might be able to enter, but you can make it very inhospitable. You can make it a very inhospitable place for them. Your creation skills will provide you with your first and best line of defense. And what you did today was an important step forward. A bit clumsy, he added with a smile, but important nonetheless. I guess it's progress, said Will. I tried to get across the river the other day, but that plan failed. Ah, yes, the bridge, said Jeremy. I saw it begin to form. A logical solution, and it very nearly worked. For a moment, I thought you might succeed. Quite a lovely structure, though it did seem rather ambitious for an impulsive creation. Conjuring, creating or altering things spontaneously, before your own eyes, is always a challenge. And the more complex the creation, the more its existence affects the rest of your world, the more difficult it is to create. Building a world from scratch is relatively easy, he continued. That is, it happens naturally. We are confronted with a blank canvas, a field of infinite possibilities where everything is equally balanced. Every possibility has the same chance of being actualized. Thus, the slightest bias in favor of one of those options, which can come in the form of a single thought, will bring it into existence. There is no resistance, from outside us at least. Altering an already existing world is trickier. For once created, a creation has its own inertia. Its tangible existence hardens the idea, the inner image you hold in your mind, which gives it more weight. In order to change your world, you must erase one image and replace it with another. You may succeed, perhaps easily, but because there will always be some resistance to this change, it requires a certain amount of energy. You understand this, yes? I think so, said Will. Whenever I've intentionally added things or made changes to Wysteria, I spent some time picturing the way I wanted them to be. I also had to convince myself that the new versions were real. Jeremy nodded, then resumed. Conjuring, or sorcery, is even more difficult, for you are standing face to face with a reality that you must deny. It takes a strong will, particularly for a mortal dreamer who still has one foot in the seemingly immutable waking world. If you could master this skill, you would have nothing to fear from intruders. "What about Will's flight over the ravine?" Emily asked him. "Was that conjuring?" "Technically, perhaps," he acknowledged. "But one could say that he cheated." "Why?" said Will. "Did you help me?" "No, not at all," said Jeremy. "When I say cheat, I do not mean that there was deception or that you broke any rules. But you did not overcome the primary obstacle. Rather, you found a way around it, a tribute to your cleverness rather than your skill. Do you see why the bridge failed, but why you were able to summon a wind?" Jeremy paused to allow Will a moment to think about his question, but not long enough for him to formulate an answer. "You could not build the bridge because it conflicted with what you saw in front of you," he explained. "Even with your eyes closed, it was difficult to challenge the reality of what you knew was there and wasn't there. It was for you an unimaginable change. In addition, conjuring requires witnessing the transformation itself, not just the end result. A mortal mind has difficulty with this. In the waking world, it is unnatural for things to suddenly spring into existence. In the case of your flight, however, you managed to circumvent this issue by summoning an unseen force, the wind. In your experience, a concrete object, such as a bridge, cannot suddenly appear, but a wind can. This creation caused no inherent contradiction in your mind, and thus, little or no resistance from your world. Of course, it required skill, for being carried through the air as you were is improbable, but not impossible. Will laughed. "Not really," he protested. "I was only guessing. I'm just lucky I wasn't hurt or killed." "It was more than luck," said Jeremy. "As I've noted before, you have good instincts. The thing that intrigues me most is your landing. You didn't use the wind to cushion your fall. You altered the ground somehow, did you not?" "Yes, that was a last-second decision," Will told him. "I couldn't avoid hitting the ground, and I couldn't create a safety net. So I tried to imagine that the ground, even though it looked solid, was actually soft and elastic. It worked, for a moment at least. Then the ground hardened. I guess I lost my concentration when I bounced." "Interesting," said Jeremy. "In a way, that was more of a feat than the flight over. You had to transform the ground in front of you. And yet, you concealed the transformation from your senses. What your eyes saw did not change." "Does that mean Will cheated again?" Emily asked. "He may have avoided the most challenging aspect of conjuring, but he did succeed in changing the physical configuration of the world. and rather quickly. Jeremy leaned back and stared into the branches above him. "Yes," he said, slowly nodding his head. "Bravo." And that concludes Chapter 20, and we will return later this evening with Chapter 21.